The Ronald T. and Gayla D. Ferrer Media and Civil Rights History Award honors University of South Carolina Professor Emeritus Ronald T. Ferrer and his late wife, Gayla D. Ferrer. Ron Ferrer is a former dean and professor emeritus of our school. He helped create the school's doctoral program. He is the author of A Creed for My Profession, Walter Williams, Journalist to the World, published by the University of Missouri Press in 1999. Williams was the founder of the Missouri School of Journalism, the first journalism school in the U.S. But I want to emphasize that this award is named not only for Ron, but also for his late wife, Gayla D. Ferrer, in recognition for her many contributions to the School of Journalism and Mass Communications, particularly to the many students and faculty she supported and nurtured through the years. She was a tremendous asset to our school, and with this award, we honor her gifts to us and her memory. The Ferrer Award recognizes the best journal article or chapter in an edited collection on the historical relationship between the media and civil rights published in the previous 2 years. I am delighted to recognize 2 of the Ferrer Award judges who are here with us today. Phil Jeter of Winston-Salem State University and Ernest Perry of the University of Missouri. If you two would please stand and be recognized. I'm delighted to announce that this year's winner of the Ronald T. and Gayla D. Ferrer Media and Civil Rights History Award is Carol Stabile, professor at the University of Oregon. She receives the $1,000 cash award and a plaque for her article, The Typhoid Marys of the Left, Gender, Race, and the Broadcast Backlist, published in the September 1911 issue of the journal Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. Ron and Carol, will you please come forward? Just stand and look pretty for a moment. Here's what the judges have said about Carol's work. Drawing on a rich array of primary sources, Carol Stabile's essay offers a fresh look at the intersection of anti-communism and civil rights activism during the 1950s, focusing on the broadcast industry as a primary arena of struggle. In the process, Stabile draws attention to 2 figures, African-American musician Hazel Scott and white actor Gene Muir. Both were active proponents of racial justice and equality. Scott is particularly notable as a black woman who briefly hosted her own television show in the 1950s. The essay convincingly demonstrates how the views of a small minority, which aggressively defines civil rights as a sign of communist sympathies, could effectively leverage the power of the federal government and corporate sponsors to marginalize and effectively silence individuals sympathetic to the cause of racial justice during the 1950s, a formative decade of television as well as for the civil rights movement. Carol will give the Ferrer Award lecture on her award-winning book and a larger book project tomorrow afternoon. Her lecture is a centerpiece of the symposium, and I look forward to seeing all of you there. If we could just formally present the award to Carol, and then we can all...
On behalf of my son, Bradley Ferrer there, my daughter-in-law, Carol, and indeed for my whole family, I'm saying what an honor it is to be here and present this award. Carol, this is a wonderful achievement and makes us all very proud. My wife, who was mentioned, was not a crusader, but she was against injustice, and she grew up in Memphis, and I grew up south of Little Rock, and we saw a lot of it when we were kids. And so I think, I didn't pick this topic, I didn't pick the winner, but I think she would be very proud.
Carol holds the rank of professor at the University of Oregon in the School of Journalism and Communication and the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. She's also the director of the Center for the Study of Women in Society at Oregon. So she is truly transdisciplinary and wears many, many hats at Oregon, and I hope they're paying her a triple salary for everything that she does for them. I want to recognize our Farrar Award judges this year. Dr. Patricia Sullivan, who's a USC faculty member who cannot be with us today. She's on sabbatical. She may well be at Martha's Vineyard at the moment in her renovated home. Dr. Phil Jeter, who is sitting right over here from Winston-Salem State University. And Dr. Ernest Perry, who may not be, oh, he had to leave, I'm sorry. He's going to someplace warm, a Caribbean beach, I've heard, he told me, from the University of Missouri. As you all know, this award recognizes the best journal article or chapter in an edited book about the historical relationship between media and civil rights published during the previous 2 years. And Carol's work, certainly, it knocked the socks off our judges. I heard beyond what they wrote about her prize-winning article for you all to read in the program, in which Carol read yesterday. They all also reported to me independently how impressed they were with this work. The work that Carol won this award for was published in the September 2011 issue of Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. The title is The Typhoid Marys of the Left, Gender, Race, and the Broadcast Blacklist. This is an article that's a part of a larger book project. Carol has presented another piece of this broader work earlier in the conference, and it's my great pleasure to present her as our speaker today.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have a lot of thank yous, which I'm going to save until the end to give them pride of place. But I do want to say at the beginning that I've been humbled since learning that I won the Farrar Award, and I've been doubly humbled listening to the papers over the last couple of days. I tell my students that the mark of a good scholar is her ability to admit what she doesn't know. And there have been lots of points during this conference where I've had to do that myself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the bigger project before I dive into the specific research. When I first started cooking up this project sometime an eon ago, probably in the late 1990s, I was thinking a lot about the disjuncture between the images that politicians conjured through the rhetoric of family values and their own experiences of family. Why, for example, did conservative politicians like Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and William Bennett use images from 1950s family sitcoms to show what they meant by family values? Why, in the words of Stephanie Kuntz, did news media refer to shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver as if these were documentaries? Now, the simple answer to that question is that conservatives certainly couldn't use their own families as paragons of family virtue. But a more complicated question about the making of those images in 1950s entertainment programs lurked behind this. Not about cultural memory, which we can argue about more later. We already have started that conversation. But borrowing a phrase from science fiction writer Philip K. Dick about implanted memories created in specific industrial conditions. My guiding research, and these are the kinds of images I'm talking about, my guiding research question boiled down to this. Why in the first half of the 1950s did television's images of family life take the specific forms that they did, especially in light of the fact that the history and practical realities of families in the United States was so much more complicated and diverse, encompassing as they did families that had survived slavery, poverty, immigration, and other massive economic and social dislocations. However universalized by decades of reruns, the desires embedded in this kind of entertainment programming for a racialized suburban order issued from a very specific ideological perspective. 1950s television was written and produced mainly by white men who shared or were induced to share a set of specific political and ideological perspectives. From the standpoint of these white men, from Ward or Beaver Cleaver's perspective, if you will, being a white middle-class boy in the 1950s was magical. That they lived in suburbs, swam in public swimming pools, and attended schools from which African Americans were banned probably never crossed their minds. Margaret or Princess's perspectives were similarly immaterial. White girls and women existed to support men and boys like Ward, Wally, and Beaver, and eventually to bear their children. When they appeared at all, women of color were invariably domestic servants. From the perspective of privileged white men, this standpoint was universal, reflecting as it did some naturalized order of things. Like Old Testament gods, they got to make these images, and not surprisingly, they were pleased with what they saw. The family values that issued from the standpoint of white Cold War masculinity were as much an industrial product as bird's eye frozen vegetables. Their iconic status ensured through the very act of suppression of stories and viewpoints that diverged from this norm. So when we think about why these particular images came to dominate television screens in what I'll call provisionally cultural memory, we think about them in terms not so helpfully supplied by the broadcast industry itself. Those were the images post-war consumers wanted, broadcast owners and producers argued, although there was, aside from Nielsen and Hooper ratings, little to verify those desires. In reality, 1950s entertainment television was born not of consensus, but of a struggle over the content of television and the imposition of a version of reality that would stretch far into the future. In contrast to this world of sitcom domesticity, in the first half of the 20th century, women were in fact making careers in broadcasting, advertising, and film. They were writers like Vera Caspary, Lillian Hellman, Dorothy Parker, and Shirley Graham. They were halves of famous husband and wife writing teams, like Ruth Gordon and Garson Kanin, Faith and John Hubley, Jean Rouverol, and Hugo Butler. In the 1930s and 1940s, progressive women like Sylvia Jericho, editor of the left-wing publication Hollywood Review and wife of Hollywood 10 member Paul Jericho, worked alongside men in left-wing political organizations. They agitated for civil rights, immigrant rights, and they advocated on behalf of refugees from Germany and from Spain. And they shared the popular front belief that mass culture could serve to educate and to encourage anti-racist ideas and social justice. So alternative understandings of gender, race, family, and Americanism were very much in the air in the years leading up to the broadcast Blacklist. A friend once described the project I'm working on as an old school women's history project, kind of recuperating and restoring the lives and works of a generation of women who have been consigned by anti-communism to oblivion. But throughout the project, I've also tried to provide a much more complex reckoning of the role women of all races and political convictions played in the Blacklist, as victims and victimizers, as opponents of white supremacy and agents of it. Different groups of women, that is, marched across the historical stage of the late 1940s in distinct roles and capacities. They carried different baggage and equipment, and they looked out at the world through dramatically different lenses. Some, like Elizabeth Dilling, Eleanor Johnson Buchanan, and Hester McCullough, were agents of the Blacklist. White supremacist native-born women who collected data for the Blacklist, helped build the networks that enabled it, led consumer boycotts, and through rumor and gossip mills, ruined the lives of the dozens of women and men caught in their crossfire. And there's a copy of Elizabeth Dilling's very famous book. Many others, like radio and television writer, producer, and actor Gertrude Berg, were white New Dealers who supported unions and opposed segregation, but whose class and race privilege resulted in more moderate political engagements. Still others were proponents of civil rights like Hazel Scott, Freddie Washington, and Jean Muir. A smaller group that included Shirley Graham Du Bois were members of the Communist Party and vocal critics of US-style imperialism and white supremacy. Race, class, gender, and politics shaped women's interactions and encounters with anti-communism, and I tried throughout this project to do justice to these complexities. I've also tried to do my best to stay true to the historical traces left by this generation of progressive women. Many of them left voluminous archival holdings. Some like Joan LaCour Scott because of their better-known husband. Some like Vera Caspary and Shirley Graham because they believed their lives were important parts of the historical record. In order to piece together the impact that the Blacklist had on them, I've read their work, published and unpublished, as well as personal letters and other documents. In the case of Jean Muir, I located her daughter, who generously agreed to talk to me about the events that destroyed her family. She recently donated her mother's papers to the University of Oregon Library. I read what was said about the work of these women in the press of their day, as well as what was said years later by people who either admired or despised them. I requested and was sometimes given access to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's records of these women's subversive activities and the surveillance to which a number of them were subjected. I read transcripts of the House Un-American Activities Committee's hearings, Blacklist rags, and anti-communist writings. In drawing on this varied body of information, the book is organized into two parts. Because the context for the Blacklist is so crucial to understanding the women's individual stories, the first part of the book sets the stage by describing the anti-communist forces that were converging on the broadcast industry in the late 1940s. So chapter 1 provides a historical and cultural context for the Blacklist, while chapter 2, Anti-Red Networks, describes the activities of right-wing women like Elizabeth Dilling, author of the Red Network. Dilling was the author of this first and probably most important list of suspected communists in government and media. She was a far-right proponent of anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance. She also shared information with individuals and organizations, including the American Legion, the VFW. She was very friendly with J. Edgar Hoover, and she also passed along information to the House Un-American Activities Committee, all of whom thought that this was her lists were very credible and helpful. Chapter 3 is the Typhoid Marys to the left, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second part of the book looks at the stories of 3 women writers who were blacklisted because of their political points of view. Beginning with the most radical of these women, Shirley Graham, who's at the top, seated at her typewriter, and concluding with the least radical, Gertrude Berg, who's surrounded by all the scripts that she wrote. It's a really wonderful picture of her. Together, these chapters point to the wide range of thought that existed under the umbrella term progressive at the middle of the 20th century. So chapter 4 looks at the story of Shirley Graham, and I talked about her yesterday. Screenwriter and novelist Vera Caspary, author of the noir classic Laura, is the subject of the next chapter. And chapter 6 turns to the case of Gertrude Berg, whose name did not appear in blacklisting rags, but whose career in broadcasting ended because of her liberal political viewpoints and also her relationships with others touched by the blacklist. This was a less direct anti-communist tactic known as graylisting, and it ended her career. Berg was probably the most important woman in broadcasting in the 1930s and the 1940s, and her very popular sitcom called The Goldbergs successfully made the transition from radio to television, only to be killed by the blacklist. Historian Ellen Schrecker has pointed out that, and this is a quote from her, "It's possible that the main impact of the Red Scare may well be in what did not happen rather than in what did, the books that were never written and the movies that were never made." And inspired by that observation, the final chapter of the book looks at the traces that these blacklisted writers left and the marginalized roles assigned to them. I've looked at scripts that they wrote for the BBC because some of them did get work at the BBC. I've looked at the scripts that some of them wrote for children's shows because a number of them were relegated to children's shows. I like to joke that I want to write an article called Red Lassie. A number of them, and if you read the scripts for Lassie, it's a very strange experience. I've also read on-air television scripts that languished on desktops and file cabinets, the novels they published, and the ideals that they continued to pursue. So the final chapter really helps to understand the mediocrity and intolerance of American television entertainment programming for the second half of the 20th century, not as an inevitable product of the technology itself, its production processes, or even simply commercial influence, but as a kind of enduring effect of the chilling of speech and the extinction of creativity affected by anti-communist collusion with networks, advertisers, sponsors, and corporations. Now, on to the blacklist itself. The story of what happened to these women is straightforward. Intelligent, anti-racist, progressive women had been working in or around the emergent television industry in New York City as writers, producers, and actors. And it's important to keep in mind that in the late 1940s, there is no such thing as a television writer. So there are lots of people migrating into the industry, trying to imagine what this category of television writer will look like. And as in other moments of media ferment, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the mix, and lots of contradictions and possibilities for change. So these are creative, independent-minded, idealistic women who rejected conservative notions of femininity and womanhood, and they built lives and careers that reflected very different desires and dreams. They married later in life to men who were either much older or much younger than they were. They were single mothers. They had abortions. They slept with women and men. They talked about orgasms and birth control. The slender volume that would mark the beginning of the end of all this was published in June 1950, just a week before the beginning of the Korean War. Titled Red Channels, a report of communist influence in radio and television, it would come to be known as the Bible of the Blacklist. And it was sent to journalists, it was sent to hundreds of people on Madison Avenue, so it was distributed by anti-communists quite widely. The authors of Red Channels were former FBI agents who loathed the turmoil of post-war culture, troubled by the comparative freedoms women, people of color, and progressives had enjoyed during the war. They devoted themselves to the restoration of what they saw as traditional American values. And although their crusade was publicly aimed at communists and groups they identified as communists, the rhetoric of contamination cast a net so wide as to encompass a range of political thought, from very moderate New Deal liberalism to revolutionary communism. They proposed a theory, they called it the third violinist theory. And what they meant by that is that you could have a third violinist who was a communist, who was spreading the taint of communism to the second violinist, and thence to the first violinist, and thence to the conductor of the orchestra. So you can see that this was a very porous understanding of how people could be influenced and contaminated. So who were the first two women who were targeted by anti-communists? And I think here it's worth mentioning that the first two public cases of blacklisting were women. Jean Muir was an actress who had just been cast as the mom on a sitcom where, as one contemporary journalist put it, quote, as Mother Aldrich on television or the radio, the actor would have no opportunity to say anything but the innocuous lines put in that harassed lady's mouth by the program's author. Hazel Scott's stardom was similarly modest, although she was a well-established musician in New York City. She was also the star of her own variety show, so she had more control over content and over her image than did Muir. As public figures, both Muir and Scott believed that they had a responsibility to advocate for social justice, which they did, particularly civil rights, and they used the prestige conferred on them by stardom to do so. They spoke at events, they spoke at rallies, and they supported a wide range of political organizations. So anti-communists were aware of both of these women because they had public records of civil rights activism. Neither Muir nor Scott, though, had worked extensively in broadcasting before 1950. They were also both making their way into the industry. And their lack of celebrity status was really important to anti-communists because it made them low-hanging fruit for the blacklist. Neither of them had an established broadcast following, which allowed anti-communists to ventriloquize a largely fictitious, outraged audience without fear of a consumer backlash, since these stars didn't have an established fan base that could protest their firings. It would be a whole year before anti-communists felt confident enough to take on Philip Loeb, who played Gertrude Berg's husband in the popular sitcom The Goldbergs. And they waited to do that because the Goldbergs had been canceled at least 3 times. Each time it had been resurrected because Gertrude Berg collected these fan letters, and she would take them in to executives and say, look at all these fans. The executives would get hundreds of thousands of phone calls. So she had really been able to leverage the fan base into support for a program that had long been marginal. Muir and Scott also had another circumstance in common that not only highlights the specific vulnerability of professional women, but their value as anti-communist targets as well. Both were married to prominent men who had their own contentious relationships to the anti-communist movement. Muir's husband was Henry Jaffe. He was lead attorney for the American Federation of Radio Artists, which was at the time fighting internal battles with anti-communists, specifically over the imposition of loyalty oaths at the networks. Hazel Scott was married to New York Congressman, Baptist minister, and politician Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. And this was a moment in which Jaffe was really establishing himself in broadcasting. And in 1950, Powell was also standing for re-election. So they were both also caught in the crossfire. For what Hazel Scott described as, quote, the headline-seeking super patriots promoting the broadcast Blacklist. These relationships with prominent men not only guaranteed more bang for the buck in terms of publicity, and the publicity almost always mentions their husbands as well, but it also increased the pressure on these women to concede to the demands of anti-communists. The impact of being blacklisted on their own careers was devastating. But the secondary effects of the blacklist on husbands and children were potent incentives for cooperation. Joanna Rapf was the daughter of blacklisted screenwriter Morris Rapf, and she said that blacklisted workers were men and women of deeply held convictions and remarkable integrity who risked a great deal, including their family's security, to stand up for what they believed was right. For blacklisted women with families who are already defying conventional roles as wives and mothers, the pressure to choose between these convictions and their family's security was immense. And Muir and Scott had to weigh the potential damage to their careers and families against the damage to their husbands' careers in evaluating their respective defense strategies. Now, the story told about Muir at the time that she was blacklisted is a story that's shaped subsequent accounts, and it hewed closely to her star image as an aging blonde ingenue cast as sitcom mom. In the early 1930s, Muir had appeared in a string of Broadway shows. She was discovered by a Warner Brothers scout while starring in a play called St. Wench. Yeah, I know. There weren't a lot of options in 1930, as we'll see in a minute. In 1933, she eventually made over 20 B pictures for Warner Brothers, playing a string of sassy ingenues in films like Desirable. Muir's statements to the press after she was fired from the sitcom The Aldrich Family capitalized on this less than threatening star image in her role as wife and mother. In her prepared statements, she claimed to not recall any association with the organizations listed in red channels, or she claimed to have resigned from all of them. In later testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee, a despondent and unemployed Muir staunchly denied being a member of the Communist Party, but held firm to her conviction for the three reasons for her political activity. The first one was that she had supported the Spanish loyalist fight against fascism. She respected and admired FDR, and she remained committed to addressing, quote, the overwhelming problem of the colored citizens in our country. Although Muir was blacklisted because of her alleged affiliation with the CPUSA, her record suggests a much stronger connection to the civil rights movement. The white mainstream press did not report on Muir's civil rights work at all, but the Chicago Defender's accounts reorient her story. Initially, the black press had been skeptical about Muir's involvement in the anti-racist politics with good reason. In 1941, the Defender reported, quote, that au fait actress Jean Muir, who has recently turned producer, is doing a master show, perennial classic, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in the latter part of November. Entirely revised, Muir is on the lookout for her colored cast. But by the 1940s, convinced that her political commitment was genuine, Langston Hughes wrote approvingly in The Defender about Muir's contribution to an NAACP testimonial for Secretary Walter White in 1944. He was a close family friend. Muir praised, quote, the fine work Walter White did in Hollywood in educating the movie industry to abandon its old stereotypes of Negro caricature. She also told the gathering that moviegoers should write to the studios when they, quote, saw a picture with decent Negro roles in it, as well as when they saw an abomination like Cabin in the Sky, which was directed by Vincent Minnelli. Like many of those listed in the pages of Red Channels, Muir had been most active during World War II. She shared the stage at several NAACP events with Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman she greatly admired. All of these activities were reported in the pages of The Defender, a newspaper that anti-communist leaders like Elizabeth Dilling, who was located in Chicago, and J. Edgar Hoover, whose FBI had been monitoring the black press since the 1920s, were keeping a close eye on. In 1943, Muir worked with Walter White and Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia on a pledge of unity intended to prevent rioting in Harlem. Muir's involvement with that campaign was not that of a star who merely lent her name for publicity. She was a rank-and-file organizer who, over a 10-week period, collected 96,000 signatures with her infant in her arms. Muir also volunteered as a child care worker in Harlem for the duration of the war, caring for children whose mothers were full-time workers. According to her daughter, Muir identified as a feminist, but her life was a study in contradictions. She was 5 foot 10 inches tall. And she hated the fact that she would have to walk in trenches on film sets so that she would appear to be the requisite 2 to 3 inches shorter than her leading men. She thought that Hollywood was pretentious and ridiculous, but she craved the attention it offered. She was outspoken in her political beliefs, but throughout her life, she was intimidated by most men, especially her husband. Her casting in the Aldrich family was announced in Variety in the spring of 1950 with no anti-communist response. But in June, Red Channels listed her name with 9 offending items next to it. She had no idea that there was any kind of storm brewing until Sunday, August 27th, when she arrived at the studio for the final taping, or the final rehearsal of the sitcom before the live taping, only to discover that it had been canceled. There was a note on the studio door saying that it had been canceled. She went home in tears. On the following Tuesday, General Foods Corporation, the program's sponsor, issued a formal statement to the press announcing that they had fired Muir because she was a, quote, controversial personality whose presence on the show might adversely affect the sale of the advertiser's product and provoke unfavorable criticism and even antagonism among sizable groups of consumers. There's a lot of debate about how many calls they actually received because there was no count taken. The show was canceled on a Sunday, according to the pressure, so there was no one at NBC in the PR office to take calls. So whether they received the calls or not is an interesting question. But whatever the actual number, it was hardly a mandate considering the thousands of letters of support routinely received by a program like the Goldbergs. The mainstream press made no mention again of Muir's civil rights work, but the Chicago Defender drew a clear line between the anti-communist crusade against her and civil rights. Muir was, the Defender noted, quote, among those Hollywood stars who consistently contended for better acting roles for Negroes in the films. Another article observed, it strikes us as more than coincidental that a large number of the 151 radio and television artists listed happened to be champions of full democracy for all Americans, whatever their race or religion. Hazel Scott was also numbered among those champions of full democracy, but her firing occurred with substantially less media attention than that of Muir. And anti-communists didn't want to cancel the Aldrich family, but they clearly wanted to cancel Jean Muir's television show. It featured a black performer on a new medium that anti-communists held to be the domain of white Americans. It was thus, to them, a visual violation of segregation, allowing images of African Americans into what were imagined to be whites-only domestic spheres. Now, Scott had spent her life engaging in such challenges. She'd been born in Trinidad in 1920. Her parents immigrated to New York City in 1924, settling in Harlem. She was a talented, Juilliard-educated musician and performer, a fixture at Barney Josephson's Cafe Society, where she was mentored by jazz greats Billie Holiday and Mary Lou Williams, and where she socialized with a kind of a who's who of artists who would go on to be blacklisted. She performed on Broadway. She was also really conscious of what had happened to other African-American performers, especially in Hollywood. She'd watched as talented African-American performers like Louis Armstrong, Hattie McDaniel, Butterfly McQueen, and Bill Robinson were cast in humiliating roles in Hollywood. And so she resisted for a long time the gravitational pull of LA. From Birth of a Nation, she wrote, to Gone with the Wind, from Tennessee Johnson's to my old Kentucky home, from my beloved friend Bill Robinson to Butterfly McQueen, from bad to worse and from degradation to dishonor, so went the story of the black American in Hollywood. She refused to accept the stereotypical roles to which black women were consigned in the motion picture industry. Scott turned down the first 4 roles offered to her, all of which cast her as a single maid. When she did make the move to Hollywood, she wrote a set of demands into her contracts intended to give her a measure of control over how she was represented. She was to have final cut privileges when it came to her musical numbers. She would only appear in films under her own name and not as a character represented by someone else. So she would only appear in films in this way, seated at the piano, just as she would be in a nightclub. She was to have full control over her wardrobe, including the right to wear her own clothing if she deemed the studio's wardrobe unacceptable. And in fact, when she broke with Columbia Pictures, she had a fight with the notoriously sexist and racist production director and later president Harry Cohn over a costume that she felt stereotyped blacks. This control over image and reception extended her to her tours as a musician. Scott had a clause in her contract advising that she would not perform in segregated venues. In 1948, for example, while performing in Austin, Texas, she took the stage only to discover that black and white patrons were seated in separate areas. So she refused to perform and had to be escorted from the city by Texas Rangers. Why would anyone come to hear me, she told Time magazine, and refused to sit beside someone just like me. After being told by a waitress in a restaurant in Spokane, Washington, that she and a companion would not be served, quote, because they were Negroes, Scott brought a successful suit against the restaurant in 1950. According to historian Dwayne Mackey, Scott's victory in Spokane inspired civil rights organizations to pressure the Washington state legislature to enact the Public Accommodations Act in 1953. The other important thing to keep in mind about Scott is the segregated state of television at that point in time. And even though African American musicians had appeared on television in the late 1940s and 1950s, as they had in the early days of radio, these appearances caused massive conflicts with networks and sponsors alike, who claimed that these representations produced by New York City liberals would alienate Southern viewers. So Variety host Eddie Cantor angered sponsors first by featuring a young Sammy Davis Jr. on his show, and then using his own handkerchief to mop Sammy Davis's brow. Cantor, whose criticisms of Hitler and fascism in the 1930s had caused numerous sponsors to drop him from their programs, boldly responded to this racist outcry on the part of the sponsors by booking Davis for every show for the remainder of the season. Milton Berle also clashed with Texaco when the company tried to prevent him from booking the Four Step Brothers, refusing to go on stage himself unless they were allowed to perform. Of course, by 1956, neither Berle nor Cantor had a show. Within this context, the Hazel Scott Show not only had the audacity to feature a black woman, the black woman in question starred in her own show. So when it premiered on July 2nd, 1950, it made history. It was the first television show to star an African American. Nat King Cole's similarly short-lived variety show didn't appear until 1956. Variety noted that Hazel Scott has a neat little show in this package, its most engaging element being Scott herself. The 15-minute variety show was very quietly canceled just a few months later on September 29th, a little over a week after Scott had voluntarily appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now I'm going to skip over how they defended themselves in the interest of time, because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. But I do want to say a few things about the fallout from the blacklisting. In Muir's case, she was pretty much abandoned by her husband, and that's a really important distinction between her case and that of Hazel Scott. Many years later, Muir recalled that Jaffe, quote, had to defend me, and at the same time, he had to conduct a law practice. He couldn't risk being called left-wing. Muir's friend, actress Madeline Guilford, was more blunt. Jaffe made Muir get a settlement with NBC, Guilford recalled, that prevented her from taking legal action against the network. As her legal counsel, now her husband is serving as her legal counsel, always a bad idea. Jaffe influenced Muir's decision to ask the NAACP not to pursue a proposed boycott against General Foods, and he also persuaded her to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1953 in a last-ditch effort to rehabilitate her political reputation. And that was another decision that she lived to regret. Years later, she wrote, "I now wish I'd fought my case through the courts, no matter how long it took." Jaffe, who in the 1960s became a very successful television producer, had too much to lose to take on the battle to clear Muir's name. It was really better for his career to let her disappear from the headlines. She refused to provide additional names to the FBI, which was really the only way to clear your name and to sort of prove your political purity. Depressed and out of work, she struggled with alcoholism and severe depression throughout the 1950s. But in 1959, she went to Reno, divorced her husband, and got sober. She went on to play a handful of roles on television and stage in the early 1960s and taught drama at a number of universities for the rest of her life. But as late as the mid-1960s, television networks were still preventing Muir from telling her stories. In a television interview in 1968, the names of the advertiser, sponsor, and network who'd been responsible for firing her were blooped out of her account. So she gave her account on the interview, but they took out those names. She refused to buy General Foods products until the end of her life, telling her daughter, "They're the people who are responsible for my losing my job." And saddest of all, it turned out that the FBI's conviction about her membership in the Communist Party was based on a clerical error. She had been misidentified as a Communist Party member through a transcription error on the part of one special agent, Edward No One. No one was reprimanded, but Muir was never advised of this fatal mistake. Now, Scott's self-defense was quite different. When she appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee in September 1953, she insisted on reading her statement into the record in its entirety. They wanted to start questioning her, and she said, "No, I have a statement, I'm going to read it, you're going to listen to it." In it, she denied that she was ever knowingly connected with the Communist Party or any of its front organizations. She directly impugned Red Channel strategies and integrity, describing herself as one of the victims of Red Channel's technique of half-truth and guilt by listing. She asked Virginia Congressman Burr Harrison, "If any committee, an official committee, lists me as having two heads, does that make me have two heads? And does that give Red Channels the right to publish that I have two heads?" Prophetically, Scott warned her audience, such vicious slanders would kill years of preparation, sacrifice, and devotion of American entertainers. As a result, she concluded, instead of a loyal troop of patriotic, energetic citizens ready to give their all for America, you will demoralize them and end up with a dejected, wronged group whose creative value has been destroyed. But as in the case of Muir, anti-communists had already made up their minds about Scott in advance. According to the FBI files, Scott had always been in the pro-communist group in the entertainment field. And as had been the case with Muir, Scott's refusal to provide additional names further damned her in their eyes. Now, because she wasn't as dependent as Muir on film or broadcasting for her livelihood, she continued to perform in the US and Europe, even getting sporadic bookings on television and variety shows like Cavalcade of Stars. Still, as had been the case with Muir, the blacklist combined with her husband's infidelities in personally devastating ways. She suffered a breakdown in 1951 and again in 1957. And like Muir, she divorced her husband about a decade after the publication of Red Channels. Network and sponsor concessions to anti-communist bullying, and it really was bullying, in these first two cases set a grim precedent for how future blacklistings were handled. When General Foods and NBC were called to account for Muir's firing by journalists like Jack Gould, sponsor and network alike defended their decision by stating that they had to fire her because their presence on the show would anger audiences and jeopardize General Foods' ability to make profits. But networks and sponsors were not responding to the protests of individual or even organized consumers. They were responding to shadowy threats made by organized anti-communists whose reach beyond their immediate constituencies was always questionable. In fact, a Gallup survey conducted in October 1950 and commissioned by General Foods showed less than 40% of the nation had ever heard of the Muir blacklisting, and less than 3% could relate the name of General Foods or Jell-O with her name. Moreover, when networks and sponsors rallied to the defense of better known and more profitable stars who'd been identified as communists, no further protests ensued, so that when the network stood up to the bullies went away and nothing bad happened. And the unsuccessful attempt to blacklist Lucille Ball in 1953 is a case in point. These anti-red networks were not, as networks and sponsors would have it, evidence of some populist backlash against progressive performers and ideas. Rather, anti-communists were communicating to all those working in the new medium the limits of permissible forms of representation. Women like Muir and Scott, who had been politically active in civil rights and who refused to conform to conservative ideologies of appropriate female behavior, were these quintessential typhoid Marys of the left, to use William F. Buckley's term. They were all too visible reminders of resistance and challenges to the emerging broadcast status quo. Their presence in the industry was a threat to an anti-communism invested in white supremacist formulations of female submission. Women's civil rights activism was especially threatening to the social order, challenging as it did both sexism and racism through the rejection of white male authority. In the lethal wake of Red Channels, I'm getting ahead of myself. In the lethal wake of Red Channels, writers remaining in the industry learned to self-censor content that might give anti-communists any cause for suspicion. When writer Rod Serling was working on a script based on the lynching of African-American teen Emmett Till, he was made to understand that a black victim would not be acceptable to sponsors. But this changed, so in response to this, he dropped the idea of, quote, a Negro victim and changed it to an old pawnbroker, e.g. an old Jewish man. But this change proved insufficient. The southern location had to be changed too. An unspecified location was not good enough. It had to be New England. Writer Reginald Rose was told that the black family in his Thunder on Sycamore Street, a drama based on the real-life attempts of a black family to move into suburban Cicero, Illinois, quote, would have to be changed to something else. A Negro as beleaguered protagonist of a television drama was declared unthinkable. It would, they said, appall Southern viewers. To survive the purge, writers either internalized the need to avoid anything that might be construed as controversial, or else they quietly left an industry that was becoming ever more hostile to progressive ideas. In an interview, television writer and producer John Marcus later described networks' oversensitivity to special interest groups is emerging during the Blacklist era. But this claim and claims like it are deceptive. The Blacklist institutionalized an oversensitivity only to right-wing conservative groups whose threats to picket and boycott television programs employing black or gray list cultural workers became part of the common sense thinking of the industry. Long after the era of direct sponsorship had ended, producers and writers self-censored progressive content to avoid any hint of controversy. In the words of Gertrude Berg, to avoid anything that might bother people. Of course, people referred to those on the conservative end of the spectrum. It was, of course, perfectly acceptable to offend women and working class people through demeaning stereotypes that persist today, to offend people of color through images that represented them as lazy, licentious, and inherently criminal, to disappear immigrants, lesbians, and gay men, and thoughtful people as a whole. Agents of intolerance, anti-communists made it unacceptable to offend the finer sensibilities of racists, sexists, homophobes, anti-Semites, and other disciples of hatred and ignorance. I like to think that the act of remembering the progressive writers who fought to create multidimensional and complex depictions of American family can help us better understand the Blacklist fallout, not only in terms of representations of gender, race, and family on American television, but in terms of the disappearance of the very absence of a history of struggle over these representations. In the 1980s, conservative politicians, and let us not forget FBI informants like Ronald Reagan, could refer to the 1950s as an era of safety and picket fences only insofar as this history of struggle could be kept off screen. The lives and work of progressive women and men targeted by anti-communists stand as a timely reminder of the many ways in which the 1950s American family was as unhealthy an industrial product as a processed food U.S. television viewers were also being encouraged to consume. Okay, remember, because I said I would save them for the end. And I know it's customary to do that, but I wanted to leave you with these notes. Thank you so much to the University of South Carolina School of Journalism and Mass Communication for organizing this conference, which has been amazing, and so graciously hosting this event. I want to thank also the committee who judged the Ferrer Award. And I think I speak for everyone here when I express my gratitude to Kathy Ford and her graduate students for organizing this conference and running it with such good humor and grace. I am, of course, tremendously grateful to the Farrar family and so honored to be the recipient of the Ronald T. and Gayla D. Farrar Award in Media and Civil Rights History. I've spent so much time over the last, it's got to be more than a decade at this point. I spent so much time with these papers of these amazing women that I've been writing about. Muir Scott Graham, Vera Caspery, Gertrude Berg, the amazing Hannah Weinstein, who I didn't even get to mention. And I'm pleased to think that this work might encourage renewed attention to their lives and to their work. And like Shirley Graham, many of us do this work because we understand how important it is for our students and our colleagues to encounter these stories of struggle, courage, and conviction. And I think we honor the lives and legacies of the women and men and movements we write about by making sure that they're not, as Shirley Graham put it, right from history. Dr. Ferrer, I believe that the year that this award was first made, you said, speaking of your wife Gayla, that when we give out this award, we might want to say something to dedicate it to all faculty spouses. And over the course of working on this project, I've had much cause to think of the role that loving and politically committed spouses played in supporting the women I was writing about. Gertrude Berg was an industry powerhouse only because her husband Louis transcribed her scripts, managed her household, and encouraged her aspirations. From the time she was a girl, W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged Shirley Graham to experiment and extend herself and learn. When writer Ruth Gordon walked out of an important meeting with Paramount producer Harry Cohn because he told an anti-Semitic joke, her husband Garson Kanin was so awestruck that he could do nothing but stand there and shake his head in admiration as she walked across the lawn.
Right.
And my own work could not have been possible without similar support from a partner who's always been willing to put my career before his. So a big shout out to all the partners and spouses who make us stronger and better people. Thank you.